There's no denying that no matter how one personally feels about them, the Star Wars prequels are definitely divisive. Though the hatred towards them doesn't seem to be what it once was, there are still many who will famously argue and debate for their merits in either direction, with some insisting that despite their superficial flaws, they're actually underrated masterpieces, while others will say that they are utter garbage and are frankly given too much credit as is. But that being said, one thing that many people, including both defenders and haters of those movies, tend to forget is that the Star Wars prequels arguably saved Star Wars in many regards. And today, I'd like to explain, while keeping my personal opinion out of the conversation and staying completely fair and impartial, how this was actually the case. Though keep in mind I am by no means a film historian, so I'll only be covering the basics in this video and not really going into an in-depth analysis of it here. Okay, so just to make one thing immediately clear, when I say the Star Wars prequels saved Star Wars, I don't mean that they prevented the brand from falling into obscurity. Because let's face it, the original trilogy, and especially A New Hope, were so innovative and widespread that they will never fall out of the public consciousness no matter what. Heck, some could even argue that the original trilogy will be the Shakespeare of our time, something that's watched, admired, and appreciated for its geniusness even 500 years from now. Star Wars was so big that it's simply a part of history, even outside the entertainment industry, and nothing will ever change that. And I also don't mean they saved Star Wars in the context that they completed the story of it or made certain things in the original trilogy easier to understand. I mean, they do arguably allow you to appreciate certain characters and their actions more, but that's not what we're discussing here. The point is, when I say that the Star Wars prequels saved Star Wars, what I'm talking about is how the public perceives it. Because for about 10 years, between the release of Return of the Jedi and George Lucas announcing he would be making The Phantom Menace, Star Wars was viewed very differently than it was today. As especially in the late 1980s, Star Wars was seen more as a wave or passing fad, as it were. Something that swept up public interest and took the world by storm for a while, but now that it was over, it would simply be forever viewed as the trilogy that was the talk of the town in the late 70s and early 80s. And as a result, many people, especially movie critics, would take extreme issue with movies of that time that made references to Star Wars, since many saw that as a surefire way to date the film, because per their logic, and without the ability of hindsight, it wouldn't be the cultural juggernaut that it was 10 or 20 years down the line. It's even for this reason that Spaceballs was torn apart by critics when it was released in 1987, because not only did many feel that Mel Brooks was a lot better at genre parodies, and that by satirizing Star Wars he was giving into commercialism and riding off of trends rather than doing what he did best, but they also felt that he had released the film, quote, too late, as Star Wars mania had already been dying down for quite a while. So many felt the movie was already dated when it came out and would only get worse in that regard over time. However, the Star Wars prequels completely changed that mentality. When The Phantom Menace was announced, and especially in the build-up to its release, Star Wars mania came back stronger than ever, and even if it wasn't what most were expecting, though let's face it, being one of the most hyped films in history, it living up to those expectations was probably never going to happen. They still proved that Star Wars wasn't simply a relic of the late 1970s and 80s, but something a lot more significant than that. It was a sweeping epic told over the span of many years, and something that could be used to transcend generational gaps, cultures, and any other barriers we humans have. To put it simply, at least until The Last Jedi, which is most definitely something I am not getting into, Star Wars was viewed by many as one of the most important franchises in history, and it was the prequels that gave it that distinction. Because once again, if they had never come out, the original trilogy would not be viewed the way it is today. Though they'd still be very highly regarded and watched by many, don't get me wrong, but it would probably just be viewed as yet another franchise that was extremely popular in its time, but today has run its course. And the era that it was made in would also be much more heavily associated with it, being viewed more as 70s, early 80s type movies, rather than those years just being when it all started like it is now. To put it another way, the original trilogy made Star Wars a pop culture phenomenon. The prequel trilogy ensured that it continued to be viewed that way, as well as grow beyond it to be seen as perhaps the most important franchise in movie history. Again, you can argue for the merits of the prequels and how good or bad they are all day long, but there is no denying that they most definitely changed how people perceived Star Wars for the better. Because to put it simply, they are the ones that brought Star Wars into the modern age. They are the ones that ensured that Star Wars wouldn't be left in the dust and simply seen as dated because of when they came out. Because in actuality, Star Wars is about as timeless as a story can get. There is nothing in the original trilogy that even remotely hints at when it was made, so therefore anybody can take the same morals and messages away from it regardless of when they are watching it. But had it not been for the prequels continuing Star Wars, some, if not most, would have viewed it from the perspective that it was made from 1977 to 1983 by default. But again, because the Star Wars prequels brought Star Wars mania back in full force and proved both Star Wars' timeless appeal and how it transcends generations, it's proven to be perhaps one of the least dated movies of the entire 20th century. And as a result, Spaceballs and other movies from the late 80s that reference Star Wars can also see a similar turnaround, as those references are apt to be more appreciated now than when they were released, with Spaceballs in particular being seen by many as one of the best parodies of all time, simply by virtue of the fact that it was a parody of Star Wars. And if you don't believe me on that, just compare what people say about it now to what they said about it in 1987, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, with many saying it was already dated before it was ever released. But ever since the prequels came out, people have come to appreciate it a lot more because they made all things Star Wars relevant again, and arguably turned it into something even greater in the process. Now, once again, how good or bad the Star Wars prequels themselves are is irrelevant here, because the point is that they were at least seen as passable enough to not only bring Star Wars back to its former glory, but helped turn it into perhaps the biggest movie franchise ever up until that point. Now, I know there's also some who will argue that what I'm giving the prequels credit for actually belongs to the first novel in the old expanded universe, Heir to the Empire, since that kept many Star Wars fans loving Star Wars until the prequels came out. But the thing is, the amount of people who read the expanded universe versus not only saw, but got insanely hyped for the prequels is no contest. I mean, sure, the expanded universe did ensure that Star Wars would always have a dedicated following, and I'm not trying to take that away from it. But it was the prequels that made it what many view it as today. Or at least what they viewed it as before the sequels came out, but once again, I'm not getting into that here. The point is, the expanded universe did do its job of keeping people interested in Star Wars, but as far as the general public, which does make up most of the audience, let's face it, goes, it was the prequel trilogy that cemented Star Wars' status as one of the biggest franchises in history, making it something more than just movies to watch. So, love them or hate them, there's no denying that the prequels did at least do one good thing as far as making Star Wars a timeless, beloved film series goes. Okay, I think I've proven my point here. So now I'd like all of you to tell me, do you believe that the Star Wars prequels coming out when they did majorly helped people see Star Wars as much more than a series of game-changing films released in the 1970s and 80s, or do you still believe they didn't contribute anything to Star Wars' long-lasting appeal and legacy? Please feel free to tell me in the comments below. And thank you all for watching. It is all very appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.